Now that we've discussed sound leakage and explored our microphone and polar pattern choices, let's set up the preamp for the guitar. You'll arrive at a better mix if the sounds you record are loud enough to mask the noise floor that is generated by the electronic components of your gear, but not so loud as to distort. To accomplish this, it's important to understand the concepts of noise floor, signal-to-noise ratio, and headroom. By getting good levels now, you keep your mix options open, rather than limiting your mix to masking issues you could have avoided from the start.
Let's get a guitar level first. Jackson, can you play the loudest part of the song, please, for me? I want to record the incoming signal at a high enough level to mask the preamp and recording room noise floors, while leaving enough headroom to fit the dynamics of the guitar player's performance without causing any distortion.
Every room has ambient noise, and every piece of equipment produces noise that is inherent to the electronic components it's made of. Together, they have a similar sound to the sound of a shell to your ear, like so.
This is what we call the noise floor, an inescapable amount of noise in our signal. We work around this by choosing the right mic for an instrument's sound pressure level. If an instrument is loud enough to make you wince, you're safe to use a dynamic mic. You should consider using a condenser or ribbon mic for anything quieter. Headroom, on the other hand, is the safety zone between having a loud enough signal through the preamp and a signal so loud that it overdrives the preamp and distorts. That's why I set the preamp to the portion of the song that's the loudest, to make sure that my signal will not distort. Musicians tend to play harder when they're in record, so I typically trim the preamp back just a little bit to be safe. I keep an eye on the preamp levels throughout the entire recording process, and I'm always listening to make sure there's no distortion. Here's an example of what a distorted signal can sound like. Experienced studio musicians and singers know that it's important to deliver smooth performances. Sometimes musicians, especially singers, produce sudden loud spikes in volume that distort the preamp. When I find myself in this situation, before trimming back the preamp, I'll work with the musician to deliver a more smooth and controlled performance and maybe introduce a compressor.
So, we're done setting up the preamp for the guitar, and we discussed what the noise floor is and the importance of understanding signal-to-noise ratio and headroom. Now let's set up the compressor for the guitarist. In order to create a good balance of sounds in your mix, you need to set an average loudness level, eliminating occasional spikes in volume which would distort if turned up further. This is the main reason why we use compression. To achieve a smooth-sounding mix, it's important to understand the concept of compression and how the controls associated with it work. The compressor's controls are ratio, attack and release, threshold, makeup gain, input, and output.
Jackson, can you please play the loudest part of the song again? So we've set up the preamp to capture the full dynamic range of the guitar, its loudest peaks and its quietest resonance. Next, we want to even out the volume fluctuations a little bit by lowering the volume of the loudest peaks. That's where the compressor comes into play. One way to better understand compression is to think of it as an automatic volume controller. Imagine sitting at a console, setting the preamp just right, but then using the channel fader to control the level sent to the digital audio workstation, or DAW.
You want to send a nice healthy level to the DAW, but you don't want to clip the signal when it has loud peaks. So you ride the fader, pulling the volume down at loud moments and push the fader back up for quiet moments. That's approximately what a compressor does. There are a few main controls we need to set. First is the ratio. How much do you pull the fader down at loud moments? By a little or by a lot? That's what the ratio is telling us. A ratio of 2 to 1 means that for every 2 decibels over your threshold, or point at which you want to lower the loud peaks, you pull the gain down to give you 1 decibel of output. A ratio of 10 to 1 means that for every 10 decibels over your threshold, you pull the gain down to give you 1 decibel of output. The higher the ratio, the more extreme the effect.
The 1176 has 4 ratio options, so we'll go with its smallest, 4 to 1.
Next is the attack and release controls. These tell the compressor how fast it should react to the sound and how quickly it should stop affecting it. Think of it as how quickly you would pull down the fader and how quickly you would push it back up to 0. The faster the attack, the quicker the compressor reduces the sound volume. The slower the attack, the slower it will react to reducing the sound.
For really percussive instruments like drums, you typically want to keep the attack slow so you leave the transient intact, allowing the drum to retain its crack or its power. For acoustic guitar, we want it to feel smooth while still maintaining its naturally percussive sound, so we'll use a slower attack. If I set the release too fast, it's going to push my volume back up quickly, which for a sustained sound can give a weird pumping feel to it. If it's set too slow, it's going to hold the volume down a little longer, potentially dulling the sound of the next drum. The goal is to have an attack and a release setting that complements the natural dynamics of an instrument. In our example, dynamics of the rhythm guitar change quickly, so a fast release is probably going to be more appropriate.
So here we have our compressor. Our ratio is set at about 1.5 to 1. We're pulling down our threshold and you can see that more of our audio is being compressed. The lower the threshold, the more the audio is being affected. You can see that our waveform has gotten smaller because we have turned down more of it. Now we are using our output, or makeup gain, to recapture that original loudness that we lost when we started pulling down the threshold.
Make sure the signal in your DAW has plenty of headroom. You don't want to run the risk of the signal clipping. While overdriving an analog piece of gear can sometimes give a pleasant crunch to a sound, digital clipping is harsh like a click or pop. By giving yourself enough headroom, you minimize the chances of this happening while also maintaining proper gain staging, resulting in a much richer sound. A good compressor can run you around $1,300 to $5,000. There are excellent digital compressors you can purchase for your DAW for much less money. For example, you can buy a compressor plug-in from Waves for $150 to $450. If you're on a budget, you might want to consider purchasing a plug-in compressor over a discount outboard compressor.
While setting up the preamp, we discussed noise floor, signal-to-noise ratio, and headroom, which allowed us to get good levels for the guitar. We also set up the compressor for the guitar and reviewed its controls such as ratio, attack and release, threshold, and makeup gain. These same concepts apply to the vocals. So let's go ahead and set the preamp and compressor for the vocalist.
Now we're going to set up the preamp for the singer. Let's get a vocal level. Hey Jackson, can you sing the loudest part of the song, please?
You laugh like a thunderstorm and your smile is a calm and warm embrace. It's a feeling that I'd chase forever. I pull the curtains open just to watch the sunlight dance upon your skin.
Here too, I want a preamp level high enough to reduce the noise floor while leaving enough headroom to capture the full dynamic range of the singer's performance without distorting the preamp. Typically, when I record a singer, I always have the final mix in mind because the lead vocal track will be the focal point of the song. Singers in general, but especially female singers, can produce mid-range frequency volume spikes that can pierce the listener's ears. When I record singers, I typically ask them to retrack any out-of-control notes. I'm going to use a compressor to gain some control over the dynamic range of the vocals. While I generally use more compression on vocals than acoustic guitar, like all outboard effects printed during tracking, it can't be undone. What I'm aiming to do here is to only manage the loudest peaks of the vocal. Again, that's why we're auditioning to the loudest part of the song. I'll use a ratio of 4 to 1, again for a subtler effect. And I'll use a slower attack to rein in Jackson's peaks without altering his sound too much, along with a release that breathes well with his performance. In this case, because of his fast dynamics, we'll use a fast attack. While I can give you general settings to use, this is really a situation where you've got to use your ears. You're listening to make sure that the sound isn't dull and it's not pumping or fluctuating in volume noticeably. If the performance sounds smooth, you've got good settings. But again, Less is more at this point. We can always compress more later. So don't set your input too high and watch your output as it hits your channel or DAW. So we placed our mics, set our preamp levels so that we're capturing the full dynamic range of the performance, and send our signal through compressors to control dynamic range before our signal hits the DAW. We're almost ready to start recording, but before we start, let's check how much leakage we're getting in our mics while Jackson performs this song.
A promise I couldn't make. My heart is yours to take. Come now. I'm drunk with possibility, sleeping just to see you in my dream. Many miles away you are, I'm reaching for.
If I hear too much leakage in one or both of the mics, then I'll adjust the mic positioning until I hear a balance I like. If you do adjust your mics, make sure to recheck your preamp and compressor settings. Even a small amount of movement of the mic can throw off your initial settings, so it's always good to do a final sound check before recording. The separation I'm getting now is really nice. I'm pretty happy with it. Ultimately, I'm listening for a sound that I'd be happy to hand over to the artist right out of the gate if I had to. Thus, I want a great performance and a good balance of sound between the two mics. Because we're essentially doing a live recording, we'll need the best simultaneous guitar and vocal performance we can get. Any fixes of additional parts with punch-ins or overdubs will sound awkward and obvious in the mix because the previous performance will still be there featured in the other instruments tracks. We're ready to track the song, so let's get started.